How do you design a golf course that can host major tournaments, but still be enjoyable for the average golfer? That's what I'm talking about today with Mike Cocking. Mike is an Australian golf architect and a partner with the firm OCM alongside Jeff Ogilvy and Ashley Mead. Recently, OCM completed a redesign of Medinah Country Club, Course 3. This course is scheduled to host the 2026 President's Cup. So in order to understand how golf architects can balance elite tournament golf with everyday amateur play, Mike and I will dig into how he thought through this project at Medinah, how he created holes that will test the abilities of the world's best players without making regular members miserable. It's not easy. I'm Garrett Morrison, and this is Designing Golf. So, Mike, you were a high-level amateur player initially, before you were an architect.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Did you think about golf architecture differently when you were focused on playing than you do now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think when I was really young and playing competitively, I'm not sure I really understood why I liked particular holes. I knew there were certain courses I really liked, certain holes I really liked, but I hadn't really joined the dots, you know. And it probably wasn't until a friend gave me The Anatomy of a Golf Course, Tom's book, and I had the confidential guide, and that was a big learning curve for me. And then I was playing competitively and traveling a lot overseas, playing competitively. Just as I started to get good, I was on different teams and things, you know. So I went to the UK, and it was pre-internet. So I would reference the confidential guide and say, you know, if we were playing at Hoylake or something, I'd look through and there'd be 3 or 4 courses in the area that Tom had rated very well, and he'd sort of pointed out things to look at. And so I'd write away to them. And then when I was there for the tournament, I'd go and either play or just walk those courses. So that for me was a big learning curve. And then when I came back home as well, I would start looking a bit more critically at the courses.
You said you liked certain courses, but you didn't know why.
Yeah.
Were they the same courses that you like now? Was there just...
Yeah, I'm motivated. Well, I think visuals play a big part for me. So, you know, I always loved Royal Melbourne, and I think it was the scale of it and the style of the bunkering and just the general aesthetic of the golf course. But then there were holes there that, you know, you had to make interesting. They're interesting decisions, you know, whether to take on a bunker or play away from the bunker, and I had, you know, you kind of figure out that, oh, if I play away from the bunker, the shot into the green's a bit harder, or, you know, it's a bit longer, or it's a shittier angle, or whatever. Yeah. So I think generally speaking, probably when I was really young, it was sort of at the tail end of that era of where hard was sort of seen as being better. You know, there was that era of, you know, where people saw places like Firestone and stuff and thought that was the, you know. So that probably changed for me. You know, as I've got older, I think I typically like courses that are more fun and wider and more interesting rather than, you know, necessarily challenging me.
Did you believe harder was better for a while? Is that something that you absorbed from people who were around you and took seriously?
Not necessarily. I mean, there was a certain, you know, there was a certain sense of pride if you went and played a hard course.
Yeah.
You know, and you played well or you hit some good shots. But no, I don't think so. You know, I think you, as good players, you do often fall into the trap of thinking a course that you played well on is good. You know, that's pretty common. Yeah. You know, you have a good score there, and therefore it's
always hard to separate that out. Even people who supposedly know a lot about architecture or study it.
Absolutely,
it's trying to separate out that good feeling about playing well.
Which is why, I mean, to be honest, when I go and see a golf course, I actually prefer not to play it. I prefer to walk it,
right?
Because you do get a bit too focused on, or you look at the course through the lens of how you've played it that day, but also where your ball is on the fairway. You know, if you miss the fairway to the right, you don't know all the cool stuff. You didn't see all the cool stuff that was happening down the left of the hole.
Right.
You know? So yeah, these days, in a perfect world, I'd go and walk a golf course in the morning and maybe play it in the afternoon. But you invariably don't have the luxury that much time.
I do that when I can, but it makes for a long day if you see
absolutely.
more than one course in a day.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, if that's the one course you're seeing, then maybe you can do that. So when you were focused on playing, were there particular types of courses that you found particularly challenging? What for you made a difficult golf course when you were playing?
The first time I went to the States and played, I actually really struggled with the rough around the greens, to be honest. I found
because you just weren't used to it.
Yeah.
You grew up here,
yeah.
Short grass around the greens for the most part.
Yeah. And
that's different.
Yeah. And my short game was probably one of the strengths of my game. I was a good putter, but very good chipping, bunkers, pitching. And I didn't hit a lot of greens in regulation. That was probably, I wasn't that consistent, So here or in the UK, if I missed a green, I would back myself to get up and down. And when I went to the States, I found I'd hit 10 or 12 greens in regulation, but the 6 or 8 I missed. I just didn't, I couldn't hit that shot. I couldn't master that shot. To be honest, I still struggle a little bit with it, but Jeff's kind of shown me a couple of things. I've quizzed him about it. It's just not a shot that comes naturally to me. So
yeah, your design partner, Jeff Ogilvy, often says that short grass tends to bother most other players.
Yeah.
But I guess that equation is flipped depending on what your initial experience is. Most players will grow up, especially in the States, will grow up playing with rough around the greens. And so for them, short grass around the greens can be a kind of kryptonite.
Yeah, and look, for most people, and certainly it's an argument that we make at a lot of the courses we work at, particularly in America, that we would much prefer to see short grass. It's a bit more, it's a more interesting, way to treat the area around the green, more shot options, and it can be a lot trickier for better players too. Mm-hmm. The irony is that for me, it's probably the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Yeah.
So really what you're doing is you're going around and building courses
just make
that
it
are
easier
easy
for me. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about the Medinah Course 3 renovation.
Yeah.
Our theme today is, how to make courses more challenging or more interesting for elite players, and maybe doing that at the same time that you make them more fun for amateurs.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are interested in this question of how that's accomplished. It's a big issue for golf architects right now, especially since at the top level of the game, the way the game is played is changing so much.
Yeah.
And it's hard to adjust to that. It's hard for architects to find new ways to challenge players who are constantly breaking through the defenses of various, classic courses.
Yeah.
So your firm, OCM, recently completed a redesign of Course 3 at Medinah Country Club in Chicago for people who don't know. This is a course that has been highly ranked, has hosted a number of majors, will host the 2026 President's
26.
Cup.
Yeah.
And so how did this job come about?
It's a funny story. I was at Shady Oaks in Fort Worth, which was sort of the first course we did in America. That was our kind of big break, I would say. And I still remember I was on the 18th green. It was the last green we were to finish. And an email popped up on my phone from the course superintendent at Medinah, then was Steve Cook, and asking if we'd be interested in being shortlisted for this Medinah project, which was like, yeah. It's like, it's Medinah.
Am I going to say no?
I mean, seriously. And not 2 days later, I got another email from the Australian government saying, if you don't come home now, you may never come home. Because this was when COVID.
Yes.
So this is March.
You better re-enter the country.
Yeah, this is March 2020.
Okay. Wow.
So, and I think the first whispers of COVID that we heard was, I want to say about December 2019 was when there was sort of a few reports, and I was still going back and forth each month to America. So it went from sort of elation, thinking, wow, we'll just, I think I spoke to Ashley and Jeff and said, well, I was just trying to arrange, let's go up to Chicago and we'll spend a few days there. And then all of a sudden it was, the chances of us getting this job have just diminished. So the club, they were very good. They were very patient. I went home, but we continued to converse, and we ended up pitching for the job from Melbourne. We hadn't seen the course. Jeff had seen the course. Jeff had played there in the 2006 PGA, which Tiger won.
Yes.
But his memory of the course was not that clear. I mean, he played with Tiger and Phil, and so there were millions of people. And so, you don't get necessarily a great appreciation of every hole. You're just looking at the 22-yard wide fairways that you're on.
He played with Tiger and Phil.
Yeah, it was the first 2 days, and he played well. I want to say
that was around the time when he was really in great form.
Well, he'd won the US Open that year. Yes. He was probably top. I think he got to 4 in the world. It was probably around that time. So he was playing really well. So we pitched on it. We were very fortunate. A good friend of ours was living in Chicago and was able to take some drone footage of the course. And I remember being on the phone with him saying, well, could you maybe take some photos from this position, right at the first green, or can you go over here? Can you go over there? So we got some very good drone footage, some good ground shots. We had some really good historical records. We had enough to put a pitch together and say, well, if we were to win the job, this is the sort of things that we'd be thinking of. These are the sorts of courses we like. We had a Zoom call. And then in the end, it worked out that Shady Oaks was just about to open. And so we couldn't get there, but we arranged for the Medinah Greens Committee to go down to Shady Oaks. And there they at least got to speak to a client and got to see a course that we'd designed and understand what we like and what we don't like. And they saw some things there that they really, really liked. So we won that job. We ended up doing a lot of the conceptual work actually still here because we still couldn't travel, couldn't get over there. And then in sort of June or July 21, I think, Ashley and I went over to the States for about 8 weeks. And history's shown that was such a critical visit for us. We had to get government permission. It was weird. We were in full lockdown here, and a day after we landed, we were at Wrigley Field with 45,000 people with no masks.
Australia versus the US, yeah.
It was like, what the hell is going on here?
Welcome to America.
But it was an important visit. I think if we hadn't have gone, I'm sure, the club would have had to look elsewhere.
Right.
You can't design it from here. So we had to get there. But we also looked at a site down in Georgia, which ended up being the Fall Line, which is our first new project in America. So that visit was literally, that was the starting point for us of working in America. So it was very, very, very important.
From the club's perspective, what was the impetus for bringing you in, changing direction?
Look, even if they didn't want to redesign the golf course, they had to spend a lot of money upgrading it. So it didn't have a drainage system on course 3, which is pretty amazing. So course
in Chicago, especially.
Yeah. So course 1 and 2 did. And a big part of the upgrade of both of those courses was getting a macro drainage plan in there. The irrigation system was old. Things like cart paths were all, in need of upgrade. The greens were really struggled. They'd struggled with turf there for a long time. I remember Steve Cook pointing out that year that Hale Irwin won, they were spray painting. They were painting fairways and painting the edges of fairways so that they looked green.
Wow.
They struggled with turf. So there were too many trees. Greens were too small. They struggled with sort of access and egress, and so there was a certain number of things they needed to do. So I guess their point was, well, if we're going to spend all of this money on upgrading the infrastructure, why wouldn't we look at a redesign? Because the average members had seen the course. It was very highly ranked, but that had kind of dwindled. And then I think, to be honest, there were a number of people there that recognised that it was a brilliant club, a wonderful club. But looking critically at course 3, they really felt that it could be much better than it was.
Was part of the brief to make it more challenging for pros? The backdrop of this being Justin Thomas going out there and lighting the course on fire at a PGA Tour event in 2019, 2018, sometime around there?
Yeah. I think it was the BMW.
Yes, right.
And interestingly, he's since come back and played Medinah with a friend.
Didn't shoot 61 again? Or
he didn't,
whatever
and
he did.
it was interesting. He said, because I sort of heard this story secondhand, but he was playing terribly that week. And he was saying that, I spoke to my dad the night before he had that round, and he said, I really wasn't playing well. And he said, and if you look at that round, he said, like, he held a wedge shot, he held everything he looked at. Like, it was he said, I'm so sick of people blaming me for, redoing the golf course. I mean, we're not, but...
yeah, exactly. It's like, or is it credit? It's not blame. Yeah.
No. So it was just one of those rounds that, could have been anywhere. He literally held everything.
Right. Yeah.
So, look, it was. I mean, I think they are very proud. They're very proud of their tournament history. So they were conscious of, they didn't want it to be torn up. In the future. But so there were a number of different goals. There were those that looked at the architecture, there were those that looked at tournament history, and there were those that looked at the turf quality and the infrastructure and stuff like that.
Okay. So there are a number of things that you did to course 3. We can't really go through all of them because it really is quite the reimagining of the golf course.
Yeah.
But just to give people an idea, what was the character of the course before you started working on it?
So I think one of the, it's 350 acres, very big property. There were 24 acres of fairway.
Yeah, not much.
Not much. It was incredibly difficult for the average golfer. Fairways were narrow. It was a classic sort of what I would, as a Melburnian, it was what I would regard as a classic parkland American style golf course.
Right.
They were lucky. They had beautiful trees, amazing oak trees. There's a handful of trees on that course from the 1650s, which is very cool. Beautiful old oaks. It was narrow. It was lush. It was green. It was a bit monochromatic. Just everything you looked at was green. All the green complexes were pretty similar, and a lot of the course features that had been built looked quite artificial, I would say. So what we did a number of different things. We certainly increased the amount of short grass. There's about 55 acres now, so more than double. There we looked at. It was not a restoration, but there were elements of the original Tom Bendelau course that we found interesting. Some of the bunkering that he had on the course was really interesting. It looked like, Tillinghast had built it. So that became the idea of the bunkering style. We wanted something much more natural and rugged. We wanted to introduce some longer fescue that would brown off to provide some textural differences. The big thing though was we rerouted the last 6 holes. That was kind of pretty bold. And to be honest, I think because we're from the other side of the world and we didn't have the emotional ties with that course, it was probably easier for us to suggest that change than if we were local to Chicago, because we didn't have that,
Yeah, the associations with the tournaments and those holes and there's I wouldn't say it's the most beloved American course, but certainly people have an image in their minds. Americans have an image of in their mind of what those closing holes at Medinah Course 3 look like and play like, because there have been these memorable shots played there.
Absolutely. So we looked at it more simply and thought, well, there's 3 par 3s that all look the same.
Right. They just cross the lake there.
Yep.
It looks kind of like a river in that portion of the property.
It does. It's narrow.
People often think it's a river, but the par 3s used to just kind of play from one side to the other.
That's right. And 2 of them in particular, 13 and 17, were even next to each other. They played in the same direction. They looked like the same hole. They didn't have they'd built a short par 4 at the 15th that probably hadn't really ticked the box of the great short par 4s of the world. And it just, I think water can be a fantastic hazard, but typically it's best when it's on a diagonal, when you play across, whether it's a creek or a river or a lake. When things like Cape holes, they're interesting because everyone has to deal with the hazard. It doesn't matter how far you hit it, and you kind of have to determine how much of the hazard you want to take on. That's, it's just a very interesting way to set up a hazard. And they didn't have that. And the fact that you played directly over the water and the greens were detached from the water meant that good players never hit it in the water, but they were impossible for the average golfer. So I guess we looked at the lake and thought potentially this is an amazing hazard, but doesn't quite work as well as it should. The 3 par 3s were all similar, and they didn't have a great short par 4. So that was kind of our starting point.
Okay. Yeah, what you're saying about hazard orientation is really interesting, because the previous course there was very linear or perpendicular in its relationship with that big natural hazard. I guess it's natural.
It is, yes. Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I think so. Even though at some point it didn't really look like it.
Yeah, I think it was a wetland, and then they did they dammed it. Yeah, that's right. It was formalized.
Okay, yeah. So these par 3s, just to use them as an example, would just play straight across it, whereas what you were looking to do was to shift the orientation of the shot so that it would run along a diagonal.
Yeah, that's right. And so we didn't think there was that much variety with the par 3s, and with the reroute, the new 13th hole plays alongside the water. So that gave the club something different as well. So it's a short par 3, which again, they didn't really have. So this is a hole that I think it's best played at probably about 145 yards. So kind of shortish. It's got like an infinity green and you can see the water behind, but then if you miss the green to the right, you're in the water. So whereas they were always playing across the water. So we sort of added a different type of hole that's usually played into the breeze. So it's kind of a fun shot with a 9-iron or a wedge. And then the new 17th does play, directly sort of on a diagonal back across the water. Yeah.
So getting back to the theme of challenging elite players, I guess diagonal hazards are one way that you can do that, because if it's just a linear hazard, as long as you have the carry number, you can go ahead and make that carry. If you're a really good player, you're not going to come up short necessarily unless it's a really long carry.
Yeah.
If it's diagonal, then you sort of have to make a decision. If you hit it in a little more in one direction than the other, then you might be in trouble. If you try to bite off too much, you might be in trouble. So that's one way, I suppose, that the new course might be more challenging to a top level player.
Yeah, I mean, good players are very good at hitting to a particular distance.
Yes.
So that's right. So
when they're not going to miss that distance very often.
No. So when you're playing across a perpendicular hazard, they're unlikely to hit it in it. If it's on the diagonal, you're testing line and length. So that's right. So they do have the ability to misjudge. So that was one thing we did. I mean, we certainly tried to improve the relationship between the playing surfaces and the surrounding hazards as well. But being the typical parkland American style course that I mentioned, there was probably 10 yards of rough between the edge of a fairway and a fairway bunker. So a lot of the bunkering was somewhat redundant. It was a very poor shot to hit in the sand. Usually you were playing from the rough. And greenside bunkers as well were a long way off the putting surface. So whilst we knew we couldn't take it to the extent of say the sandbelt, where you have putting surface to the edge of a bunker, we knew we could get a lot closer. So you'll see with the new course, the bunkers are really cut up tight to the greens. There is more fairway. The fairways are wider, but there's probably a bit more strategy now in terms of being on one side of the fairway or the other. One of the keys, to be honest, is firmness. It doesn't matter how strategic you make a golf course. You can have all the angles and width in the world, but if it's soft, those guys are so good that they can be out of position, even in the rough, and they can hit an 8-iron onto a green and stop it if the greens are soft. So firmness is critical. And there's a number of greens there that we set up to, like the first green falls away from play, so which really encourages landing short and using the ground game a bit more. But the other important aspect is all the drainage that's been added in. And so unless you had a 3-inch storm the night before, Ben, the new superintendent, has the ability to really firm that place up. And that will be the key. And firmness combined with all the short grass around the greens, plus the bunkering, plus the angles. There's no one thing. It's sort of 4 or 5 different things that I think start to achieve that balance between playability for the average golfer, but making it interesting and challenging for the better player.
How do you create firmness on a site like Medinah's? I mean, this is not the Australian sandbelt. This is Chicago. I assume it's kind of heavy clay, not typically the easiest stuff to drain or to, it's not the easiest thing to fight the weather in Chicago with your surfaces. So how do you go about creating firmness at a course like this?
Yeah, it's I mean, it is a heavy site, but it's got quite a thick layer of topsoil. They sort of look at it and, it's good black dirt will be the comment.
Not bad.
Yeah.
So it's not super rocky or anything like that.
No, it's actually quite nice topsoil. There were no, I mean, we strive very hard we don't particularly like the catch basins close to play, where you've got a big drainage pit,
right?
Next to a green.
Because that would be one way to do it, is to build these big swales next to the greens, have the greens run off into those swales and drain down at the center.
That's right.
Of the catch basin. But that's it can start to seem like predictable or kind of hacky architecture.
Yeah, so that's right. So if you were only concerned with the turf and you didn't care about architecture or aesthetics, if you had a series of catch basins all the way down the fairway and all the way around the green with quite a lot of pitch into those catch basins, you could create fairly dry surfaces, because any time it rained, the rain would hit the surface straight off into a catch pit and it's gone. Whereas architects, we're trying to minimize the number of catch basins and put them in the rough so you can't see them, and not have the big exaggerated hollows. So you're trying to strike a balance between form and function, I guess. So there's a few catch basins in playing surfaces, but they're typically off, well off greens and things. And then on top of that, there's also a lot of subsurface drainage around the greens, particularly in the approaches to the greens.
Okay, so you have to be clever about how you're draining the surfaces, and that's just one way to do it. I guess another way is just good agronomy. You need to to pay attention to the surfaces and really keep them fresh and not let them age in certain ways in order to keep them firm at it.
Yeah, and that's right. There's certain management practices. I mean, you could destroy the strategy of a golf course if you're a bit heavy-handed with the hose. So,
right.
If you were to overwater a course, it's going to lead to soft playing surfaces. So, trying to keep it a little bit lean and keep it firm and keep it bouncy is critical as well.
So then, in all of this, firmness and the challenges that you're trying to create with that, what role does short grass play with this?
I think it plays an important role. So a good example we would use with the membership there was if you've got an elevated green, we'll say, and you've got rough up to the edge, even if the pin's tucked in the corner of the green, good players will tend not to think twice about shooting for that flag, because they know if they miss it, it's just going to get caught up in 5 or 6 feet either side, and it's a relatively simple chip. Whereas suddenly if you've got short grass cut 30 yards down that bank and the conditions are firm, it forces them back in the fairway to think more about that shot. It puts a little bit of doubt in their mind, because they know if they miss it, the ball might finish 30 or even 40 yards off the green. Suddenly it's a really tricky up and down, it's tricky pitch, tricky chip shot. And the nice thing is, for an average golfer though, if they miss that shot, they can just pull out a putter and just kind of whack it up onto the green. They're not going to make their par, they're going to make a bogey or a double. But it's a more enjoyable, more satisfying recovery shot for them than just hacking it out of 3 inches of rough. So, and we used that theory in a lot of places at Medinah. A really good example is the first, where there's a 30 or 40 yards of short grass over and to the right of an elevated green. So suddenly it's a difficult shot.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that's going to bother players around the green is not necessarily rough, unless the player is you, it sounds like. It's putting them farther away from the hole. If after a miss, they're simply farther away, they have a longer shot in, they're just going to get that up and down less and less often the farther away they get.
That's right. And then if the conditions are fairly firm and bouncy, it just emphasizes that strategy. And then if you sort of work backwards onto the tee, suddenly then it is putting more of an advantage for them being in the right position on the fairway or the wrong position, or penalizing them if they're in the wrong position. So it kind of works its way back strategically, both in the fairway and even back on the tee.
You brought up position in the fairway. Let the record show that you brought it up. I want to talk about width.
Yeah.
Width of fairways is a controversial topic among those who are interested in tournament golf courses.
Yep.
There are those who say that if a fairway is wide, and the fairways at Medinah are wider now than they used to be, obviously.
Yeah.
They were quite narrow before.
Yeah.
There are those who say if a fairway is wide, then it really doesn't matter what you do around the green. Elite players are just going to blast it up the fairway, and they'll take whatever angle they get when they get there. And so the argument would go, there's not much thinking there because they're not thinking about position in the fairway because they don't have to think about position in the fairway. If you give them a certain width of corridor, they're just going to pull a driver and look at their kind of dispersion zone and just find a central point in that dispersion zone and go ahead and rip it.
Yep.
Not much thought required.
Yep.
What would be your response to that?
Well, that is true if the conditions are soft. If the conditions are soft, it is just a free hit. But I think there's enough great designs out there that that are examples of the counterpoint to your argument. Someone like Augusta is a perfect example, or Pinehurst. I mean, the 13th at Augusta, that fairway is 70 or 80 yards wide. And there's, a three-way advantage in hitting down next to the water, both shorter shot, better angle, and flatter lie. And, every yard you play to the right, it gets a much more difficult shot into that green. So if the architecture isn't there and the firmness isn't there, that's right. Players will eat up a golf course if it's wide. But I think if the green complexes are good enough and it's and it's a fairly firm, fast golf course, I think it will challenge and it will create much more interest, because at the end of the day, you can't create strategy on narrow fairways. You have to give players choices about where they want to hit to. Ironically, I quite like the fact that the US Open is a narrow golf course, because it's just a nice point of difference with all the other majors. But it gets too much, I think, when every week in, week out on the tour is a narrow golf course.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the realities when it comes to designing courses for great players right now is that great players think about course management differently, perhaps, than they used to, or at least they're more likely to have a particular method of approaching course management driven by analytics and data collection and the insights that has provided. So I wonder if, as an architect, you take some of that stuff into account in order to counteract or to account for what players are doing when they think their way through a golf course, when they're choosing targets based on a kind of different set of criteria than they used to. Does the architect have to do something different in order to keep the course interesting and challenging for them?
It's a really good question. I mean, we haven't spent a lot of time going through, shots to hole, and we did it at Medinah. We looked through a lot of the scoring averages. That was one thing we did do, which was interesting, and just the shot dispersion on each hole. But that's probably, I would say that's the first time we've really taken a deep dive into just how players, through tournaments had played particular holes and particular shots.
What did you do with scoring averages? What was the intention of looking at that?
One of them was we wanted to see how they played those par threes and how they played the short par four, so 15. It was interesting that, better players typically didn't hit it in the water on the par threes. The water didn't really have much of a role as a hazard, which is kind of what we thought. For me anyway, I think the great short par fours of the world put lots of different clubs in your hand. There's a lot of doubt. You see that around the sandbelt. You would have seen it in the last few days, where there's no single way to play, these holes. You could play anything from a 5-iron to a driver off the tee, and none of them are the right or wrong, choice. Just depends on you on the day and the wind and the pin and how you're feeling. Whereas it was clear that that's not how they played the 15th hole. So I guess it probably just confirmed some of our suspicions, I guess, about some of the holes.
This episode of Designing Golf is brought to you by Red Rooster Golf Gloves. Red Rooster Golf is all about designing a better golf glove, one that's durable, sized for everyone, and helps to improve the game. Red Rooster gloves are made out of premium, long-lasting leather. They're durable gloves, and that means fewer trips to the pro shop to buy new gloves. Red Rooster gloves fit every hand. They're thoughtfully designed for all sizes, ensuring a great fit for every golfer. They're available in right and left-handed options for men, women, and kids, and there are also cadet sizes for men. Those are the gloves with wider palms and shorter fingers. Finally, Red Rooster is devoted to helping improve this game that we all play. Red Rooster donates youth gloves to junior golf programs, and every adult glove purchase enables Red Rooster to donate more gloves. You can either subscribe to Red Rooster or get single gloves. There are various flexible subscription options, but of course you can just buy 1 or 2 gloves to cover you for the next little while. So this is the special offer that Red Rooster is making. You can buy 1 glove and get one 50% off with the code RRG50. This offer excludes limited edition gloves and can't be combined with other offers, but if you use the code RRG50, you can buy one and get one 50% off. Check it out at redroostergolf.com. All right, let's get back to the episode. Tell me about your use of out of bounds at Medinah. This is something that people are going to be curious about, the fence hole in particular.
Yeah. Sure. So that end of the property, which I guess is the northwestern end, was a prairie originally. So you've kind of got these interesting landscapes at Medinah. You've got the holes around the lake, which we talked about. Then you've got the holes through the middle of the property where you've got the beautiful old oaks that kind of frame the holes. And then the top end of the property there was originally a prairie. So it didn't have the features of the rest of the golf course. It was pretty open. And it had a dirt road running around the property in the 30s. You know, there were no houses. There was just a simple dirt track. And when we looked at the old aerials, it appeared as though the sixth hole used the boundary as a bit of a strategic hazard, you know, because the hole literally played up against it. There were no trees. And we thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Interesting feature. Not sure you could ever put that back because there's now houses and roads and cars and things like that. And then we found an old photo that showed the sixth green, and there was quite clearly a fence immediately behind the green. We thought, that's pretty cool, very interesting. And then we were concerned the view on those holes, particularly 6 and the old 10th, which is now the 7th, was unattractive because you were just staring at the road and cars and an ugly fence. And so in order to improve the backdrop, we wanted to shift those holes away from the out of bounds. And the club were really lucky they had a lot of space. So we moved those holes 40 yards, which gave us an opportunity to then plant out the boundary and to sort of shift your view line away from the out of bounds. But then the question was, well, what do we do now? And we kind of liked the idea of reintroducing some sort of boundary. So that's where the idea of, and the fact there was these old photos, and we thought, well, we could kind of reintroduce an out of bounds, albeit it's a much safer proposition now and with a nicely screened fence line. So we pitched the idea of a post and rail fence. And it sort of follows all the way down the 6th hole and the 7th hole, and in the end we actually continued on the 5th as well. So you have this run of holes 5, 6, 7, where the fence line runs hard up against the edge of the fairway. At the 6th, it runs hard up against the edge of the green. But the fairways are wide. You know, they're 60 yards wide, 65 yards wide. So they kind of there's a huge advantage for being close to the fence line, but we give the golfer a lot of space to play away from the fence. But you kind of, at some point on those holes, you have to deal with the fence line, particularly on the 6th, because the green's hard up against it. So if you choose to play away from the fence with your tee shot, the second shot now is really difficult because you're sort of aiming directly out of bounds. Now, we didn't think it was that controversial because we've played and seen a lot of courses in the UK, and there are a bunch of examples. Right.
Royal Liverpool, maybe the most famous example on multiple holes that that it's not really a boundary line. It's sort of a boundary line, but the
It is,
berm,
yeah,
the
the
berm
berm.
sort of comes into play. And
I played the British Amateur there. I remember that the first hole there, it's a 90-degree, it's a long par 4. I remember hitting a 3-iron into that green.
played as the third hole in the Open.
That's right.
I believe, but it's really fun as a first hole because it's such a hard tee shot right off the bat.
Absolutely. But then there's lots of other examples, Troon, 14th hole at St. George's, bunch of holes at the Old Course, the first at Prestwick.
It's a kind of a traditional, and for that sake, the road hole is a version of it, and so it's a kind of traditional type of hole, the boundary hole on a links course.
Absolutely.
And as much as everybody else in the world has tried to emulate links courses and building their own work in other places, the boundary hole hasn't been as much imitated because people look at it and they say, well, that's unfair.
Yeah.
The stroke and distance penalty as a punishment for missing the fairway, that's not fair. I don't like that. Let's not have that. I'm sure there will be some of that reaction to to the use of the boundary at Medinah. How do you think about that? How do you think about the issue of fairness when it comes to a hole like this?
Well, I like it because it puts even more doubt in your mind because the penalty is so severe.
Right.
Whereas if it was water, I think people are going to be more inclined to play a little closer to it because they know that they can always drop the ball up near the fairway. So I think it works really well. I mean, and interestingly, there was a little bit of concern about it early on, but now that all of the the long rough's grown on the other side of the fence and the holes have bedded in, the feedback's been unbelievable. So both from golf's hierarchy to tour players that have come and played it to the members, I think they understand it, and and those fairways are really wide. So it's not. They've understood that there's a lot of opportunity to play away from the fence. You don't have to play next to it, but I think they enjoy the challenge. Yeah.
Is there a particular hole at the new Medinah Course 3 that you're especially interested in seeing top level players play in high pressure situations? Maybe something that we haven't talked about yet.
One of the fence holes, the sixth with the fence quite close to the green. I'm really looking forward to seeing how they play that.
You could definitely see a ball just kind of roll out of bounds there.
Absolutely.
That's a very distinct possibility in approaching that green. If you're coming in from a tough angle and you don't have total control of your ball, it's gonna go OB.
Well, no, and there was some people had sort of suggested that maybe we should move the fence 10 yards further away, but my argument was that it's no different to suddenly that hazard stops being relevant. It's no different to imagine you moved a greenside bunker 10 yards away from the green. Well, it stops being a hazard, So the whole point of it is that it's close to the playing surface. If you grow 5 yards of rough or 10 yards of rough between the hazard and whether it's the fairway or the green, it stops being interesting. So fortunately, we rode through that. Probably the other hole's the Cape hole. So 16. So 16 was the old 17th, the par 3, and there was a lot of space to the right of the 17th. And every time we sort of stood on that tee, our eyes would kind of shift right and you would see the water on the diagonal to the point where you would look across to the 14th tees, the original 14th tees, and it looked like a really interesting green and an interesting short par 4. The ground was quite steep, which we were a little bit concerned about, but that hole worked out particularly well. And that's a good example of, everyone in the field there has to deal with the water. You just have to choose how much of it you want to take on.
Yeah, that's going to be a really fun hole to watch, partly because it's set in this kind of amphitheater, this natural amphitheater at the center of the property with the lake there. And I can just imagine the crowds around it and some of the fun tee shots that are going to be played there, because it's one of those holes where there's real tension on the tee shot. Is this shot going to get where it needs to go? There's going to be some doubt with the ball in the air.
Absolutely. And it is, there's a bunch of different, we built 5 or 6 different tees because we wanted people to be tempted to try and drive the green. So that shot is on for the elite players. Absolutely. So I think it'll be fun to see that. And your point about the amphitheater is a good one too, that there's so much action around the lake now. There's kind of 4 or 5 holes that are all in and around the water there, and the way the sand will kind of carry across the water and from one side to the other, I think has made for a really interesting, finishing stretch of holes.
So my final question, Mike, was it really wise for a U.S. club to hire an Australian firm to build a course that would host an American President's Cup? It feels like this was an opportunity for you to tip the scales in favor of the international team. Wow. And I just wonder what the thinking was here when it...
Hopefully. I mean, 98 was the only time that the internationals have ever won.
Maybe it would be good for the scales to be tipped
nice.
A little bit.
Look, it was brave for them to... country of origin aside, to not just go with the usual suspects, I would say. Right. So they did make a brave decision there. Time will tell how successful, but no, they're very pleased with the results. And it's not that rankings are everything, but it's nice that rankings have come out and shown that it's gone up a staggering number of spots and all of that. But it has been discussed numerous occasions that, if the internationals do win this particular President's Cup, what their reaction will be.
Not going to be able to re-enter the country, probably.
No.
All right. Thanks for coming on the show, Mike.
Cool. Thanks, Garrett.
This episode of Designing Golf was produced by PJ Clark. Thank you, PJ. If you've been enjoying Designing Golf, then leave us a rating or review wherever you might be listening to us. It's always interesting to hear feedback about the show. Also, make sure to check out Club TFE. Go to thefriedegg.com/membership to see what's offered with Club TFE. But there are all sorts of things. You get early access to Fried Egg events. You get a lot of content that we do on a weekly basis. I just recently wrote a course profile on Bandon Dunes, really went in depth on what I think that course's strengths and weaknesses are. That's the kind of stuff that we do in Club TFE. And if you've been liking Designing Golf, I can just about guarantee that you would love the stuff that we do in Club TFE. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back again soon with another episode.